in 2022, the Pew Research Center released a report saying that American Christianity would essentially go the way of Europe, that the number of nuns, non-religious people, would overtake the number of Christians within a matter of only a few decades, and American Christianity would only become a fraction of its former self. And I even did a report on this. I actually thought it was so interesting. I did a report for my school, but for a civics class. But what's very interesting to me now is that earlier this year in 2024, and I don't think there's been an update, the Pew Research Center said that the number of nuns had stopped growing, or at least may have stopped growing. They said it was too early to tell, but the fact that we went from, in less than 2 years' time, from American Christianity is, going to die, to the number of nuns has stopped growing, or at least may have stopped growing, I thought was amazing. And, and the world before 2020 was not that great, but the world since 2020 has gotten considerably worse. And the only thing that really has given me hope in this decade is that we have seen the beginnings of a resurgence in Christianity. Yes, a lot of people continue to leave Christianity, but we are starting to see a very large number of young people come into Christianity, become interested in Christianity. I mean, for instance, we've seen the Jordan Peterson effect, where a lot of young men have been listening to Jordan Peterson, and this will start them down a road to religion, most of the time Christianity. And a lot of young men have kind of followed this road to become interested in Christianity, and a lot of young men in particular have started to become interested in Christianity again. A lot of people are beginning to convert. I mean, it's not the great deluge of Christianity, but it is still this massive. It's just very interesting to see, for the first time in decades, Christianity really to be kind of relevant with younger people again, which is, I think, a wonderful thing to see. In fact, I realized this back in 2022. I realized that the Billy Grahams, the Fulton Sheens, the Billy Sundays of our generation would most likely be people who were born atheist or agnostic, people who converted to Christianity and made the faith their own. And that's a prediction I made back then, and I think it's starting to come to pass. I think many of the greatest evangelists of our generation will be people who were not born inside Christian households and made the faith their own. And I think we're very much starting to see the beginnings of a Christian revival. So I thought I would talk about a few things I think that are going to happen to Christianity in America over the next few decades. What kind of interests me is, at the time of recording, I'm 18, so if the good Lord wills, I mean, he could take me any time, but if the good Lord wills, I could live another 50 or 60 years. I mean, I'd be 68 in 50 years, and I could actually see a lot of the things I'm talking about happen. So that's something that does interest me. So I thought I would talk about some of my predictions of where I think things are going. And these are general predictions. I think it is possible that, of course, I could be wrong, but I think that these are just general directions of where things are going. I do think that it will happen differently than what I'm seeing it, what I'm talking about today. But I do think this is generally where the direction of Christianity in our country is heading. So I thought I would talk about some of the things I think will happen. The first is, I think there will be a revival. I do think that Christianity in America will experience some kind of religious revival. I think it's more a question of how different will it be from previous revivals, into how large will the revival be, more than will there be a revival at all. Interestingly enough, for 3 centuries now, we've had religious revivals inside the 40s decade. So the First Great Awakening was inside the 1740s. The Second Great Awakening started inside the 1790s, but hit its apex in the 1840s. And there was this massive awakening. It's debated over what awakening it is, but there was this massive awakening inside the 1940s. In fact, the 1950s actually are the time in American history where more people were going to church than ever before or ever since. More people were in church every Sunday in the 1950s than any other time in American history, which is honestly kind of amazing to think about. And, we've seen Christianity throughout American history go up and down, up and down. I mean, we had the First Great Awakening. We, of course, had the founding generation, and many of the first colonies were very religious. And then we had the First Great Awakening, and then we have the Second Great Awakening. We have the second half of the 19th century, which some call the Third Great Awakening, maybe lasting from the time of the Civil War to the 1930s, where we kind of see the social gospel and still a rise in Christianity. And then we have what I would call the Fourth Great Awakening after World War II. And then we have the evangelical movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we have seen Christianity in America go in peaks and troughs, and right now I think we're inside a trough, but I think we're starting to go up on another peak. I think that Christianity has declined, it has weakened, but I think we're inside the beginnings of a new revival, because the way it has worked in American history is that church attendance, church affiliation, religious devotion has gone up and down, up and down. And what has happened when the revivals end is that it helps pave the way for another revival. And I do think there will be some kind of revival of religion in our country. Do I think it will be into the 40s decade? I think that it is possible that it may start before the 40s, or it may start into the 40s decade of this century, the 2040s. I think there's pretty good chance of some kind of religious revival happening into the 2040s, because we have 3 centuries of precedent for it, and the world's pretty crazy as it is right now. You know, there's a meme you can find online. It's called World Without Religion, where like on one end it has like what science fiction told us a world without religion would look like this world of flying cars and all this awesome tech. And on the other side is what our society actually looks like, very degenerate, very nihilistic, you know, what you see when you turn on the news every day. And, you know, the world that we are seeing right now, very crazy. America is the most secular it's ever been. I do think some of this is that the 1950s was such a sugar high of organized religion in this country. I think there had to be some kind of a crash, but, you know, I do think there is a real hope, and I do believe it will happen, that there will be a recovery of Christianity in our country to some extent. There will be some growth of Christianity in our country. There will be some kind of revival. So that's my first prediction. I think there will be a revival of some sort. I can't give you the specifics of it, but I do think there will be a revival. The next thing I do kind of think will happen, well, I guess I am giving you the specifics of it. The next thing I think will happen is that it won't affect every area of America equally, because some areas of America are still fairly religious, meanwhile others are very secular. The areas I think that will change the least are the South, where I live, because religion here is still pretty strong. The Mormon belt around Utah and some of the counties surrounding Utah, and parts of the Midwest. I know there are parts of the Midwest where Lutheranism and the Reformed Church are very strong, and where Christianity is still very strong in some parts of the Midwest. So I think that in the South, I think it's more we're just going to see a movement away from traditional institutions like the United Methodist Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, and more into non-denominationalism and Pentecostalism, and I think to a lesser extent even Catholicism and Orthodoxy. I think in the South, it's more the names will change, not so much Christianity itself. It is true there has been a decline in Christianity in the South, but even now there's a very strong minority of Gen Z Christians in the South that are very devout, like a very large minority, maybe even a third. I mean, this is kind of what I've generally guesstimated. I think about half of Gen Z people in the South are going to remain Christian, or are at least kind of Christian. I mean, this is just what I've seen with my own eyes. I think at least half of the South Gen Z population is still Christian. I even know Gen Alpha. I mean, of course, Gen Alpha, they're not 18 yet, and, you know, it's hard kind of to tell, you know, but I've seen Gen Alpha even that are still pretty devout. I think that the South, we will see a decline in Christianity, but I don't think it's going to entirely end. The evangelical Christianity of the South is very strong. Forget the plane. But the evangelical Christianity of the South is very strong. It's seen some decline, yes, but it's very adaptable. It's very good at evolving and changing over time. And I just think that Christianity here will just change. I think it will become more non-denominational, and other churches too will rise. But I think church in the South will remain very popular. I think that evangelical Christianity will remain fairly dominant. I do think some changes may happen. For instance, like I do think young earth creationism will probably see some decline in favor of older creationism and theistic evolution. That's one thing I think will happen. I do think that probably stuff like a pre-trib rapture will become less popular. I mean, we will see changes in Southern Christianity, but it will still be very recognizable, I think, in the future. So I think the South will not change all that much. Mormonism in Utah and some of the counties surrounding Utah, I think Mormonism will see some decline, but I don't think it will completely lose its influence over that area of the country. And I do know there are parts of the Midwest where Christianity is still fairly strong, and I think it will remain fairly strong. But as for the very secular parts of America, particularly large swaths of the Northeast and large swaths of the West Coast, I think that we will see radical religious changes. We don't think about it, but this area of the country is actually the most religious part of the country. Like parts of the Northeast and parts of the West Coast are actually the most religious parts of America. They're just not Christian. They're leftist. And leftism, I don't think will remain. It's very powerful right now. It's very dominant, but pretty much I think leftism is so dominant because they're pretty much going on a binge. Really what leftism is right now is essentially they've inherited everything from the Christians and they're essentially spinning it all away. The left is entirely dependent upon Christianity. All the moral assumptions the left has about the world, like progress existing, the idea that there's even progress comes from Abrahamic religion, particularly Christianity. The science comes from Christianity. That is a Christian thing. The scientific method was invented by, Christians, and the left always brags about how scientific they are. I mean, I'm not solely one side or the other politically, but I don't like a lot of the modern left because it's very anti-Christian. Not the right's much better, but, a lot of the modern left is very anti-Christian. But the left today is very dependent upon Christianity. Its moral assumptions about the world are very much underpinned by Christianity. The belief in progress, as I talked about, that's underpinned by Christianity. Science is actually underpinned by Christianity. Equality of all people, that's underpinned by Christianity. The idea that you should do good to others even when it doesn't benefit you, that comes from Christianity too. And I know some people be like, oh, well, these ideas can survive without Christianity. But what we're seeing right now is that you cannot have, you can't have the fruits of Christianity without Christianity itself. It can maybe last for 2 or 3 generations, but eventually Christianity, even the most left-wing and secular areas of America, like a few decades ago, I talked about the 1950s, were still all fairly Christian. And it's really not been that long since these areas secularized. What we're seeing now is they're just running out of gas. The left is just living off Christianity. Even I've talked about this before, the Ivy League schools, all the colleges the left is very dependent upon, these all come from Christians. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cambridge, Oxford, all these places were founded by Christians and were just taken over by leftists. Pretty much every institution they have was founded by Christians or businessmen, and they just took it over. And they're essentially just going to run out of gas. They're going to spend away this massive Christian inheritance they've gained, the Christian moral foundations of our society, and all the institutions Christians built, and they're just going to run those into the ground. And I think leftism will eventually run out of gas, and that's what will happen. I do think that when leftism implodes, which I do think it will implode next 10 to 20 years, it will, I do think that there will be a massive vacuum of belief in these areas. And the area I do think that I see a lot of potential is the West Coast. The reason why that is that though the West Coast is a very secular society, it's very much a spiritual but not religious kind of society. There is still a lot of interest in spirituality, in religion, in the West Coast. There's still a very strong interest in that kind of thing out there. And in fact, out of California, over the last century, there's been several massive religious movements that have come out of California. For instance, Pentecostalism, which is now a religion practiced by thousands of people, literal millions of people. I think it's 700 million Pentecostals in less than only 120 years. We've gone from 1900 no Pentecostals to 700 million Pentecostals around the world. Pentecostalism came out of California. The Jesus movement, which is very influential, that came out of California. If you want to know how influential it is, if you've ever been to a church that has contemporary worship, you can thank the Jesus movement for that. They were pretty much the big pioneers of that kind of thing. Even many of our nation's most famous pastors are in California. Many of our nation's largest megachurches are in California. And also the New Age movement has also largely come out of the West Coast, particularly California. I do think that the West Coast will create something. I think the biggest problem with the West Coast's religious revivals is that they've been very good at affecting Christianity nationally, but they've not been very good at converting the West Coast over to Christianity. The West Coast was originally founded with mainline Protestant churches and the Catholic Church, but on the mainline church is all secularized, and the West Coast secularized over time, and there's really not been much of an alternative. I do think that the there is such a beautiful nature out there. I think that alone inherently drives religion. Not all people that spend a lot of time around nature, but a lot of people that spend a lot of time around nature end up becoming quite religious because nature it preaches of a natural order of things. It praises the creator. And I mean, this is just such a beautiful area of the country. Not all of it, but I mean, large swaths of the West and especially the West Coast are very beautiful. And I think that alone helps drive religiosity. And this part of the country, I don't really know. It's very experimental, I'll tell you that much. The West Coast, maybe Colorado too, but I mean, there is a lot of religious experimentation going around out there. And I do think that something will come up out of there. I do think that maybe a New Age church will come up out of there, but a New Age religious movement as well. But I do think some kind of Christian revival will come up out of there because there is a lot of interest in spirituality, but also that area of the country is going to be falling on more hard times as well. I mean, I'm from rural North Carolina, so of course I'm not going to be saying the best things about California, but I mean, I do think that the West Coast is going to be falling on hard times. It already is, but I think it's going to get a lot worse, economically speaking. And when people start having really tough times economically, they do typically start to fall back more to God. And I think this area of the country, because of a high rate of spirituality and hard times and a lot of natural beauty and just a history of religious revivals, Pentecostalism and the Jesus movement came out of this area of the country. I think it's very probable that another massive Christian revival will come up out of this area of the country. I think there's a very good chance of that. I don't exactly know what it would look like. I think that it would, I'll get a bit later into mysticism in the video, but I think it would look somewhat like contemporary charismatic Christianity, with perhaps some interesting flares. It's hard to tell exactly what will come up out of that area of the country. For instance, there's a very large Catholic population out there. Maybe like a trad Catholic movement could come out of there. This is pure speculation. I do think something will come up out of the West Coast. In fact, when Asbury was happening, what really got me thinking about this idea of a religious revival on the West Coast particularly is when Asbury was happening, a lot of people were sharing that they had dreams. I talked about the Asbury revival before. And I think the Asbury revival of 2023 is a great precedent for what a religious revival until the 21st century would look like. We saw this revival going viral online, the internet playing a very big role in this. Thousands of people crowding this tiny town in Kentucky because they were so hungry for God. I think Asbury set a very good precedent for what the future of religion will look like. But as I was saying, when Asbury happened, a lot of people were having dreams of the sun rising up over the West Coast. Independently, were having dreams of the sun rising up over the West Coast. And this was, and what they said is that this was symbolizing a revival coming up over the West. And I think the West, for a variety of reasons I've talked about before, is a really, I mean, I'm not saying it will happen, but I think there's a very high probability it will happen because there is, I talked about before, a very high rate of spirituality out there. That area is going to be falling on increasingly hard times, a combination of running out of water and just economic issues. And there's also just there's a tech scene. Well, the tech scene's moving east now, but there is a tech scene out there. There's a lot of universities out there. I think that there is something, I'll put it this way, it's like a big soup and there's a bunch of ingredients. And I think that there's a really good chance the soup could turn out to be really good or it could turn out to be really bad. But I'm very optimistic, especially those dreams. Those dreams really help move me that maybe something may happen out there. I think it's very likely because I've talked about before, there is a precedent for it. I mean, the Pentecostal movement came up out of there. The Jesus movement, which was very, very Californian in its origins, came up out of there too. And I mean, you know, I really do think it will happen because, once again, I'm a redneck. I'm not simping too hard for the West Coast, but I really do think that there will be something coming up out of there. So yeah, I do think that we'll see something come up out of the West Coast. As for the other secular areas of America, like the Northeast, I honestly think that the thing that most likely to happen in the North is a return, some form of traditional Catholicism, like especially like out of New York or New Jersey. I could definitely see some kind of traditional Catholic revival. I've talked about this before, but the Catholic Church in America is going to be moving to a more traditional direction. Trad Catholics are becoming more and more popular, and I think that if I had to bet money, I think the Northeast will fall more to its traditional Catholicism, because there's a very strong identification with the Catholic Church in that part of the country. Even today, being Catholic is still a part of being a Northerner, of being a Yank. It's still a part of identity up there, though of course it's in a decline. And I do think that trad Catholicism, if I had to bet, would be it's the most likely religious movement to come up out of the West Coast. I mean, sorry, not the West Coast, the Northeast. So I think that some kind of new spiritual, mystical Christian movement will come up out of the West Coast. And then for the Northeast, I think that it will likely become more traditionally Catholic. This video, of course, is incredibly speculative. I'd like to make that clear. I don't say any of this is dogma, but I think there's a very high chance this stuff will happen. Another big thing I think will happen is that this movement, this religious movement, will be predominantly led by young men. The reason why I say that is that young men are the ones that are becoming very interested, so men below 30, are the ones becoming very interested in religion right now. Yes, there are women getting interested in religion, which I think is a good thing, but Christianity in the West over the last few decades has just largely been propped up by women. Like, if you go to a lot of churches, it's mostly women there. Women just tend to be more religious than men, and it's very exciting to see young men be interested in Christianity again, because they've done studies on this. Like, the most out of every because if a father converts to Christianity, it's far more likely the other members of his family will convert to Christianity than any other member of the family. So if the father converts to Christianity or is a devout Christian, it's a lot more likely to say that he converts, that his family will convert. And if he's a devout Christian, it's a lot more likely that the family will be devout Christians. Of course, that's not guaranteed, but the father often determines the faith of the home. Not every single household, but most households, it is the father who sets the religious tone of the household. And to see so many young men become interested in Christianity is a very positive sign. And there's a lot of masculine energy going unharnessed right now. And I think that if all the masculine energy is, mostly being wasted on porn and video games right now and weed, if it could actually be put towards something productive, like spreading the gospel, I think there really would be a religious revival in this country. I think there's a lot of potential for a religious revival in this country if just masculine energy was harvested for the spreading of the gospel. And I'm very hopeful that if a large number of young men were to come to the faith, that there would be a religious revival in this country. And then just more generally, apart from being interested in Christianity, a lot of young men are becoming more conservative. Like, not just in America, but all across the world, at least the developed world, we're seeing this very fascinating trend where young women are becoming more liberal and where young men are becoming more conservative, which is very interesting. We've never really seen anything quite like this before. And at least from the Western perspective, you're becoming more conservative. There's an increasing degree that you'll become Christian, because conservative Western values are fundamentally, well, not purely, a lot of it's Greek philosophy as well, but a large swath and most of our conservative values inside the West come from Christianity. And a lot of what we've seen over the last few years is that a lot of young men and young women have, become more conservative in their thinking, and then they've become Christian. That's been a very common way that people have become Christian over the last few decades, or last 20 years, especially the last 10 years. But I do think that there is real potential. I do think a lot of young men are converting. I think this will continue to happen. And I think that if a bunch of young men do convert to Christianity, I think that it will work wonders. I really do. I think the biggest issue is the fact that a lot of young women are becoming increasingly liberal, which of course runs into issues for children. And but I do think that there is still a lot of hope. I'm just seeing so many young men convert to Christianity. That's a really good sign, and that is that means there is a really good future for Christianity. Because if the masculine energy is used to spread the gospel, I really do think there will be a religious revival in this country, a massive one too. To see masculine energy harvested for the betterment of God's kingdom on earth, I do think that it will work wonders. And I'm very hopeful to see this massive influx of young men into Christianity. So I think that this is a really big deal. I think it's one of the biggest social trends of our time is this increasing interest of young men in Christianity. I think that's a huge deal. So the next thing I think is going to happen is an increase in mysticism. mysticism, it's a bit hard to define, but I mean, Christian mysticism at least would be a greater emphasis on hearing the voice of God and feeling the presence of God, and trying to hear God and feel God. And we're starting to see a great interest in mysticism. Like I've talked about Pentecostalism before, but I think the reason Pentecostalism is so popular is that Pentecostalism is very much in the mysticism. It's very strongly interested in trying to feel God and hear God, and it's the perfect. It's very much, I think, very much a reaction to modernism. That Pentecostalism is very strong emphasis on contemporary Christian miracles, is very much a reaction to the modernism and the secularism of our day. And I think that's why Pentecostalism has become like a quarter of all Christians around the world in so little time, only about 100 years, And I do think mysticism is gaining ground. A lot of people are becoming interested in mysticism in different ways. For instance, there's been a massive revival in the traditional understanding of the Eucharist over the last few years. A lot of people are beginning to understand the importance of the Eucharist as somehow the body and blood of Christ. Different debates amongst Christians about what exactly that means, but somehow Christ is present inside the Eucharist, and a lot of young people are coming to, and even older people are coming to see the truth of the Eucharist, and a lot of people are starting to see the importance because the Eucharist is at the ultimate center of Christian mysticism, because it's the ultimate oneness with Christ. And of course, there's different understandings about what exactly oneness with God means in Christian thought, but it's the ultimate act of oneness with Christ. Drinking Christ's body, eating His blood, becoming truly one with Christ. Okay, I think I swapped up drink and eat, but whatever. It's the ultimate way of unity with Christ, and a lot of people are starting to wake up to the truth of the Eucharist, and a lot of people are becoming interested in mysticism. Like a lot of people are starting to hear God in dreams, which is very important. God communicated with people miss this all the times of the Bible. If you read the Bible, God communicates with people in dreams and visions all the time. And I'm not saying that's the primary way God communicates with us, but it's something that's been overlooked. I mean, if you go through the Bible, it is go back to the book of Genesis, for instance. I mean, what is it? I mean, Abraham, he has all those visions, at least one, but there's several visions. You go to the book of Genesis, lots of dreams, lots of visions. You go throughout the whole Bible, lots of dreams, lots of visions, lots of God working in all sorts of very mysterious, I'm not such a cliche, but God communicates in very interesting ways throughout the Old Testament, particularly. And mysticism is even very strong. You read the book of Acts. I mean, I know St. Peter has the vision of the meat, and Paul has the vision from Christ, and there's all these different visions and things of the Bible. I mean, there's a lot of mysticism to the Bible people overlook. Joseph's communicated with several times by an angel inside a dream. Dreams and mysticism is all throughout the Bible if you just read it. And I do think that there's a greater interest in mysticism inside our time. I think that's a big reason why Pentecostalism is so popular. And I think a big part of the trad appeal is that traditional Christian worships, like traditional high church, liturgical worship, the idea was that we were going to have a little bit of heaven now, that it was going to feel like heaven, that we were going to feel like we were in heaven praising God. A lot of imagery was taken from the book of Revelation with that too. And that was kind of the idea with more traditional Christian worship. And I think that's a big reason why it's so appealing. Like, even like atheists can admit that like traditional Christian buildings and traditional Christian worship are legitimately beautiful. And I do think that's why that kind of stuff's gaining more appeal. I do think mysticism will grow in importance. I think a lot of people become a lot more interested in experiencing God. And I do think that there are two massive groups that will rise up at this point. Traditional Christianity, the trads, the traditionalists, so primarily trad Catholics and the trad Orthodox, some traditional Protestants, and Pentecostalism, the charismatic movement. I think perhaps we'll see some intermixing. Like, I know that there's like 160 million charismatic Catholics, where like the Catholic faith and the charismatic has kind of mixed together. And I do think that perhaps some of the charismatic movement, Pentecostalism, strong emphasis on the movement of the Holy Spirit today, and traditional Christianity, more traditionalist thought with like the liturgical worship. I do think it is possible that we might see some intermixing, but I think probably the two strongest forms of Christianity going forward will be traditionalist, the trad form of Christianity, so primarily conservative Catholic and Orthodox, some conservative Protestant groups, and Pentecostalism. I think these will be the dominant forms of Christianity going forward because both of them are very mystical. I could also maybe see, I mean, this is probably just me fan fictioning, but Quakerism, because Quakerism is actually, I've always found this to be so fascinating because Quakerism and Pentecostalism are two traditions that are very interested inside the movement of the Holy Spirit, but they go about it two very different ways. In Pentecostalism, it's very loud. You got the loud music. It's very dramatic. You got the tongues and all these things of the Holy Spirit manifesting. But in Quakerism, it's be still, be quiet, let the inner light, who is Christ, speak inside your heart. I've always found that to be so fascinating. What a weird parallel, but I really like Quakerism. I've learned a lot from Quakerism. I've been reading a lot of old Quaker books. I really recommend the Journal of George Fox. Highly recommend it. His George Fox, founder of Quakerism, very fascinating read. Some very interesting stuff in there. A little weird, but very interesting stuff. But I could see Quakerism becoming popular again, though I'm not going to bet too highly on that. But I do think that, particularly, I think Orthodoxy has a very bright chance in American future because Orthodoxy is very rooted in history and has a very long mystical past. So I think Orthodoxy will do very well. Then kind of the next big thing I think that will be is that the internet will be the largest driver of this. The printing press was the driver of the old Reformation, and I think that the internet will be the driver of the next big change in Christianity. So, what's very interesting is that the Gutenberg Bible, which was actually published in Latin, but the Gutenberg Bible was released in 1454, and the Protestant Reformation begins in 1517. So that's a little over 60 years later from the first ever printed Bible to the Protestant Reformation. And I do think that it will take some time for the internet to fully, revolutionize Christianity. I think actually the first big thing the internet did for Christianity was the New Atheist movement. Because what New Atheism did is that it helped, it pretty much came through and helped, help rebirth Christianity because it pointed out a lot of the flaws with the pre-existing evangelical order, a lot of the narrow-minded fundamentalism, and it helped weaken that a lot, and it helped kind of pave the way for something new to rise up in American Christianity. And now, after New Atheism, because what a lot of New Atheism turned into is secular leftism, now I think that secular leftism has helped prepare the way for a Christian revival, because a lot of people are becoming interested in more conservative ideas after secular leftism has become so popular. So I do think that we will see some kind of revival in Christianity. I think that the internet will play a massive role in this. I think the potential with the internet is limitless. Like, we thought the printing press was revolutionary. The internet is, we've wasted the internet. It really is so sad. I mean, we have all the information in the world at our fingertips and we spend it on TikTok. That's really sad. But I think the potential for the internet to reform religion is immense because people can study whatever they want now. There is no regulation. I mean, you can hear any view, any perspective you want. I think the first sign of, I've seen two signs this decade, two things that I think are signs of what are to come. First is the Asbury Revival of 2023, and it really utilized the internet because with the Asbury Revival, it was trending all over online. Thousands of people were showing up in this tiny towns like Kentucky. In fact, that's the reason they had to shut it down, is because the town was just overflowed with people. It really was a sign. And then, of course, this revival spread to all these other university campuses all across America, and even churches and stuff. They were doing it too, the participating to this revival. And this was all thanks to the internet spreading this. Like, it was able to spread a lot more effectively because there's been like 9 Asbury revivals. And this was all to spread a lot more effectively because of the internet. And then I think Asbury University actually saw like a quarter increase in admissions the year after that. A lot of people wanted to go to Asbury. It was essentially a great marketing campaign. But the Asbury Revival really was a sign of what is to come. It was a movement of the Holy Spirit that was able to use the internet to its advantage, because there for about a month, the whole Christian world was talking about Asbury, the whole Christian world, and that was made possible due to the internet. Then, of course, the other big sign of, I think, what is to come, how Christians can use the internet for reform, is the Operation Reconquista movement. Even if the Operation Reconquista movement ends up failing and going up in flames, which I'm increasingly of a believer that it will actually be successful. What the Operation Reconquista shows is that Christian people can organize on the internet, because what the Reconquista is doing is, they're using the internet to make these maps of churches, conservative mainline churches all across the world, not just America, Europe and Australia too, and Canada. They're making maps of churches all across the world, and they're using these Discord servers to talk with each other and to communicate with each other, and they're taking advantage of YouTube and Twitter and all these other social media apps, Facebook, I guess. They're taking advantage of all these social media apps, and they're using them to spread the gospel. They're an example of how Christians can use the internet to spread the gospel inside the current day and age and to organize. And I think that we will only see more of this. I mean, I think that the potentials to minister and to preach the gospel with the internet are near limitless, because, I mean, what is it? I think over half the world population is now on the internet. And I mean, the potential to reach the world population is immense. I mean, a video about God can go viral, there's so much potential. I mean, a Christian, if they're you don't have to go to seminary anymore to do deep study into whatever you want. I mean, any issue you're interested in inside the Bible, any biblical issue at all, you can study hundreds of perspectives. Well, most issues don't have hundreds of perspectives, but you can study all these different schools of thought. And we are seeing this, for instance, like the trad Catholic movement, the Orthodox movement, like the massive explosion of Orthodox Christianity in America right now is almost solely due to the internet. Yes, there was some growth beforehand, but the internet has allowed where Orthodox apologists and Catholic apologists can convert atheists and Protestants into becoming Catholic and Orthodox in droves. That is the potential the internet has allowed for. And of course, the modern Universalist movement. Yes, there were Universalists before the internet, a very long history of like 20 centuries worth, but we've seen a resurgence of Christian Universalism. I never would have heard the victorious gospel if I didn't have the internet, and I assume the vast majority of you listening never would have heard the victorious gospel if you didn't have the internet, and that's because of the internet. The internet is like what the printing press did, but on steroids. Of course, the internet and all this technology stuff is a great tool and a great curse. Like if we use, it's like nuclear power. Nuclear power abuse is the A bomb and the H bomb. But if nuclear power is used for the benefit of man, it's actually a wonderful source of energy, and would actually solve a lot of the environmental and climate issues that we have today, instead of a lot of that stuff that they're trying to push on you, like getting rid of gas cars. Well, I mean, we could eventually have to get rid of gas cars, but trying to force everybody to get an electric car and trying to get everybody to stop eating meat and trying to get people to stop having children. Nuclear power would solve most of those issues. Atomic energy, and also, we help use atomic energy for stuff like chemotherapy and help with farming with isotopes. Like there is so many potentials for nuclear energy and nuclear physics. But as I was saying, the internet's the same way. The internet can be used as a way to fulfill the Great Commission, to spread the gospel all around the world, or it can be used as a way to control and to manipulate people. The choice is really ours. And I do think that the internet has so much potential to spread, the gospel all around the world. I really do think we're hopefully getting towards the end of the Great Commission, where the whole world really will hear the gospel. But I do think there's more work to be done, because so many countries that for years, like, many of the European nations, or even America, where the gospel was well known for many years, is actually now a lot of people don't know the gospel anymore. I still think there's work to be done, but the internet is allowing us to greater spread the gospel all around the world, and I'm very optimistic for that. So, yeah, I think the internet has massive potential. Another big thing I think will happen is the religious have a fertility advantage. It's just a simple fact that religious people, it's a well-known demographic fact that religious people have more children than non-religious people. Oh, Lord, what is it? I can't even remember the source right off the top of my head. It was some kind of Christian source, but pretty much I can remember what they said into this graph is that those who go to church every Sunday have a fertility rate above 2.1, which is positive. Those who go to church every, like two weeks to like every month, have a 1.6 fertility rate, which is low, but which is lower and negative, but still higher than the agnostics, the atheists. And the atheists, those who do not go to church at all, they have the lowest fertility rate of all. In fact, it was going down. It's just a well-known demographic fact that the more religious, and especially the more conservative religious people, have more children. This is just a well-known fact. In fact, among the educated, it's even more noticeable. The only real educated people having children, at least in noticeable numbers, are people who went to college, are religious people. And this is even true of places like Europe, where even though Europe's very secular, there are small conservative Christian populations that still have very high fertility. Like the Netherlands is a fascinating example of this. Like the Netherlands, very very liberal society, but there's something called the Dutch Bible Belt, where it's like 500,000, 600,000 people, and it's scattered throughout the rural Netherlands, where it's these very, very, very conservative Calvinist centers that all have a much higher fertility rate than the very low fertility rate Netherlands. And this is just a well-observed demographic fact that the more religious people, and especially the more conservative religious people, have a much higher fertility rate than the non-religious. And it is true that some of these people have, of course, some of these people have deconverted, but even though they've deconverted, we have seen enough of them stay for there to be growth in a lot of these populations. And I do think that as society continues to see, I think when secular leftism implodes, I think Christianity will become cool again, pretty much. I think that we may play around with some kind of neo-Darwinism for a while. Some kind of neo-Darwinism might become popular, some kind of new right movement. But I think in the long run, 20, 30 years from now, I think Christianity will slowly but surely begin to become the dominant cultural force again. I think that it will win. And of course, I'm a Christian, so I believe that Christ is ultimately, it's ultimately foreordained that to happen. But I do think that, I think after secular leftism collapses, that there will be a right-wing resurgence in this country, and not all of it will be Christian. But I do think in the end that the Christian side of things will win. And the Christians do have a higher fertility rate advantage than the non-Christians. In fact, the Amish are the most interesting example of this. They're completely cut off from our society for the most part. And if their fertility rate continues in growth, like by the year 2050, there will be 1 million of them. And by the year 2100, it'd be like 7 million of them. Even if that slows down a little bit, there will still be millions of Amish by the 22nd century, especially in the American Northeast. In fact, a lot of the rural American Northeast is depopulating, and a lot of their farms are being sold off to the Amish. So it's very interesting to think that some of the most secular areas of America may be Amish country in 100 years' time. Very interesting to think about that. But even among more normal religious types, I was actually, I believe it was, I want to say Cosmic Skeptic, genetically modified skeptic. That's the fella. Even he admitted that like all his fellow atheists and agnostic friends do not have any children, and he admitted that like the Christian people we know had lots of children. He lives, of course, in Texas, I think, but it's just a well-known demographic fact that Christians have more children than non-Christians, at least the secular types. And also it's not just Christians, like Orthodox Jews have a bunch of children too, but especially the more conservative, like the most conservative Christian groups of all can just cut themselves off from the outside world, like the Amish, and keep their children within. And I do think that we'll see an increasing cutting away, like the homeschool movement. The homeschool movement, I think, is the beginning of the return to something like the one-room schoolhouse of 200 years ago. Not an exact return, but I do think we're starting to see I think the hands of time will slowly turn backwards on a lot of things. And I do think that we'll see a return more to local education inside the hands of the parents. I think the massive public school system we have today may become a thing of the past at some point. I think the homeschool movement is a good example of Christians choosing to separate themselves from the mainstream society and to, keep their children. I don't know exactly how it will go. I think that there will be some children who do leave the faith, but at the same time, I do think for parents who are raised Christian, who are not raised Christian and became Christian by themselves, I do think that they will. I do think that though some people will raise their children to where they will fall away, I do think a lot of children will stay inside the faith. I do think that there is a real legitimate fertility advantage for Christians. And that's very important in, thinking about the future. I think I might have said this earlier in the video, and that's probably an earlier draft, but I had this epiphany a long time ago where I realized that for my generation, and probably the generation afterwards, that the Billy Grahams, the Fulton Sheens, the Billy Sundays of our generation will be people that were born either atheist or agnostic, people that were not born Christian and became Christian. I mean, I think that's going to be like the Billy Grahams, the Fulton Sheens, the Billy Sundays of our generation will be people who were born non-religious and became Christian because they made the faith their own. And over the last few years, I think I made that prediction about 2 years ago, before I had the channel. I've seen that come to pass. I've seen a lot of people who were born non-Christian become major Christian influencers and stuff. And I do think that this will continue. I think that there's a lot of potential for people who were not born Christian to, as I was saying, people who are not born Christian to become Christian leaders. And I think that will continue. So that's kind of where I think things are going. There's one other prediction I think that will happen. And that is, I think this will be very political. I think it'll be a lot like the Third Great Awakening. A lot of scholars will say that from about the time after the American Civil War to about the 1930s, there was a Third Great Awakening in America, which was very religious in nature, but also it was the time of the social gospel. So this was the progressive era. So I think some of the most notable things of this period were women getting the right to vote and temperance. Like a lot of the suffragette movement and the temperance movement were very much a movement of Christian women, and a lot of the movements like workers' rights, a lot of the progressive era things, they were strongly Christian. Like if you look at the populist movement, which is a conversation for another time, the populist movement of the 19th century, early 20th century, it was very, very religious. I mean, you look at William James Bryan, personal American hero of mine. He was a 3-time nominee for the Democratic Party. 3 times the Democrats chose Bryan, hero of the farming people, the populace. But Bryan famously gave the Cross of Gold speech. Thou shalt not crucify the worker on a cross of gold. Do not put the crown of thorns of greed, and do not put the crown of thorns of greed in his brow. He used very explicitly religious imagery. Another interesting thing about William James Bryan, he actually went on to be the prosecutor at the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. Fascinating man. You should really look him up, William James Bryan. But as I was saying, the progressive movement was very religious. Not entirely, but a lot of the social activism back then, 100 years ago, was being done by very devout Christians. And I think that, there is a political side to the current Christian explosion we're seeing today. Because we live inside a very secular and a very left-wing society, there has been an increased interest in conservatism and conservative values and a more political form of Christianity. I do think this form of Christianity will be political. I think inside the next Great Awakening inside our country, I do think, like the Third Great Awakening, there will be a bunch of a political side to it. In fact, the Fourth Great Awakening of the 1940s, 1950s also had a political side to it. That the decade of no commies. That's when we put one nation under God, and so the Pledge of Allegiance, a lot of stuff like that. I do think that there will be a political side to the next Great Awakening. I do think that various policies will be passed. I can't exactly tell you what it will be. I think it will be a fairly standard Christian right-wing stuff. A lot of people talk about Christian nationalism. I think it's honestly an overblown issue by the mainstream media. But I do think that we'll probably see something like that. My honest opinion is that it should be a states' rights issue. Because when the nation was founded, 3 of the states of our country were Congregationalists and 7 were Anglican. And so the time of the founders, what church and how exactly should your state deal with religion was an issue of the state. And I think that's how the country was intended to be. So for instance, I know states like Louisiana and Oklahoma have tried putting the 10 Commandments inside public schools. I think they have the right to do so, but at the same time, I don't think that should be forced nationally. So for me, I think issues of should America be a Christian nation, I think that's really an issue of the states. That's a state issue, in my opinion. I think that's how it was intended to be. But I do think that this new wave of Christianity, this new revival, it'll be political in nature. It will have a political side to it. And I do think we'll probably see a political involvement within it. So those are, generally speaking, kind of where I think Christianity will go. The other thing I think will happen is I do think, as a universalist, we will see some kind of explosion. I do think universalism will become. I think there will be a lot of persecution of universalism. Like I talked about the trad movements in a previous video, what I think it will be like with us universalists. But I do think universalism will slowly gain ground. And of course, I'm an optimist that there will be some type of new universalist church in America. Not an exact recreation, but something equivalent to a new universalist church. I think something like that has to happen for the long-term success of universalism in America. So I do think the victorious gospel will gain in popularity. I think that if our country becomes more devout and more Christian, and a lot of people are studying, I think the Christian tomorrow will be a lot more well-educated because of the internet. I mean, I know there are a lot of Christians that get dumber because of the internet, but a lot of Christians today, they can study the Bible and then some. You know what I mean? It's not just you and your Bible anymore. You can study pretty much any view of the Bible you want. And I think a lot of people, if they just stay free thinkers and open-minded, I think they will come to the good news of universalism. So I guess I'll end it by saying I think that Christians of tomorrow will be very well educated and very devout. I think there'll also be a lot of mysticism. So I think that Christians of tomorrow will be more devout. There's one benefit to secularization. Now, I suppose I'll end the video with this. There's one benefit to secularization. That is that when being Christian's not cool anymore, that is, the only people going to church in my generation are people that actually want to be there. And that means the church is going to be a lot stronger. And I think that's a good thing for the future of Christianity. If the only people in church are going to be people that want to be there, and I think we do that, I think that we will see a revival. We all have a good day. God bless. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Share, and Christ will conquer.